All I'm going to do is, I was kind of given the task of being a bit provocative, which if any of you have seen me talk before, I'm quite happy to do. So just to kind of flag up some of the kind of issues that we might come across at the moment in the kind of contemporary context that we're all operating in, that might give us pause to think about the ethical issues that we're talking about. And kind of just want to pick up really where Katie ended there, that many of these issues require us to have thought through our own personal as well as our organizational kind of philosophy and take on ethics in volunteer engagement. And my experience, kind of run a session on the philosophy of volunteering, is that quite often volunteer managers haven't done that at all, or organizations haven't done that at all, or we haven't done it recently. And I think it's really important regularly to just be checking in with ourselves, checking in with each other, in order to kind of make sure that our thinking is up to date. I can remember naively, almost 27 years ago as a volunteer manager, having a very purist view of what is and isn't volunteering and how all of that fits together. And that's a very, very different perspective than I have 27 years on, having dealt with a whole variety of different circumstances. So I just want to very quickly pick out 4 or 5 areas in which I think we need to think about these ethical issues. And for most of them, I'm going to do that just by raising some provocative questions, just some thoughts. They're not designed to reflect my opinions necessarily or HVG's, but just to get you thinking about this before we go into the breakout sessions. So it's already been highlighted that I think probably one of the biggest areas that we're going to have to think of in terms of ethics, if we haven't already over the course of the last year, is going to be around the whole issue of job displacement and job replacement. And I think there's some really interesting potential questions there. Is it our professional responsibility as the people responsible for bringing in and deploying volunteers in our organisations to make paid staff feel safe in their jobs? Or is our responsibility actually around helping the organisation deliver the services for the public and for the customers? Do we have an ethical responsibility to stand up for the rights of people who volunteer and who have the right to come in and volunteer with our organisation against those who feel that all the work that's done in our organisation should be paid? Do we have a moral and ethical obligation to ensure that our organisations strive to meet their missions first, rather than serve the needs of the paid staff that work for the organisation? Because most of our organisations are mission driven, and they're there to deliver a particular service to the public or whoever our constituency is. Does our ethical responsibility lie to that rather than to the paid staff who may feel unjustly often threatened by volunteers? And if you take that to its logical conclusion in its issue many heritage organisations have faced over the last decade or so of austerity, should we accept the closure of our organisations when we might actually be able to keep things going with volunteer support? And I know very close to where I live, in Grantham in Lincolnshire, that was very much a debate that our local museum had to get involved in when Lincolnshire County Council pulled its funding, and it switched to being entirely volunteer run and as a community hub and resource as a consequence. But if they just decided that volunteers should never do anything that paid staff had once done, then that resource would have gone from our community completely. There's also the role of volunteers, which brings me on to the role of volunteers in public and private services. So we quite often are comfortable with the idea of volunteers in non-profit for impact settings, but what about public and private sector? So as professionals, should we not facilitate volunteering by those taxpayers who have a right to volunteer in our organisations? So if we're publicly funded, then the volunteers are the very people who actually pay our wages, put the money into our organisations to help us continue to exist. Should we let our own personal beliefs, and this comes against in with the ethical toolkit that Katie was talking about, well, to what extent should we let our own personal beliefs drive our professional views and decisions? For example, that public service roles, certainly the more meaningful ones, should always be filled with paid staff. Many of you will have heard me talk in recent weeks about, should we therefore, if we're against the idea of volunteers doing meaningful roles in public services because all of those should be paid, should we therefore not be against the idea of volunteers being involved in the rollout of the vaccination programme? because there are 10,000 of them doing exactly the same role as paid colleagues. And would you be happy to wait an extra 6 months for your vaccine because it's only being delivered by paid staff rather than volunteers? And if it's acceptable in these current circumstances to have volunteers delivering those public services alongside paid staff, why isn't it acceptable at other times? Scenarios I've come across in the past of should residents of privately run care homes miss out on support from volunteers compared to those who worked in non-profit or public sector run care homes, where maybe volunteering is a more palatable solution. And if volunteering for a private sector organisation is something that you or we may feel uncomfortable about accepting, then the question I quite often raise is, why were many of us therefore quite comfortable with volunteer involvement in London 2012 and Glasgow 2016, and if it happens, Birmingham 2022, where all of the organising committees for those major sporting events are private sector companies? I think we're going to have a big ethical debate for us over the course of the next few months. Again, some of you may have heard me talking about this in other sessions. In this balance between meeting the expectation of volunteers who increasingly want this frictionless, easy experience of volunteering versus our responsibilities of safeguarding not only our colleagues and our other volunteers, but also members of the public, clients, depending on the context of our operation, and ethically stepping outside of our comfort blanket of being used to all the systems and processes and challenging those and making volunteering more accessible, and at the same time as meeting our safeguarding responsibilities. I think probably one of the biggest areas that we've kind of been challenged on this in the last year, and the HVG EDI group is doing some fantastic work on this, is in our work on equality, diversity and inclusion. So we know that we have certain legal obligations under the Equality Act, although the extent to which that covers volunteers is yet to be proven in many test cases, but we accept that we have that responsibility under the law. But then there's the ethical issues of to what extent are we prepared to tackle the attitudes of paid staff around EDI issues and other volunteers. It's by no accident that Helen Timbrell's excellent report last year on equality, diversity and inclusion, and particularly around race in volunteering, was called "What the bloody hell are you doing here?" because of the attitude of some volunteers towards other volunteers coming in with a different ethnic background. What about clients and visitors? And where do we draw the line? Whose views do we prioritise, and whose views do we support when we come across a really thorny issue that may be down to the way that a visitor to a museum is behaving towards a volunteer and the support that volunteer or member of the public gets from a member of paid staff? As well as the hiring policies for volunteers and for volunteer managers, because if we're honest, we're not the most diverse workforce in the world as volunteer managers. And how do we square that one with our personal ethics? And then finally, around agile working and digital futures. So we were having a conversation, those of us involved in organising this, just before everybody joined, about future ways of working and almost digital by default. Do we need to get back into rooms full of people again? Do we need to get back into major events or bringing volunteers together? And quite often we assume digital by default is a good thing, but it also creates many digital exclusion issues, which are going to actually ramp up problems with equality, diversity and inclusion, rather than actually solving some of those problems. Are we confident in challenging organisational decisions where they're making decisions about the future way of working, the future structure and thinking and approach of our organisations, without necessarily factoring volunteering into that thinking? And are we looking for those teachable moments to help educate others? And where do our personal ethics cross with our professional ethics and maybe our organisational values and ethics in all of that as well? So I think Katie did a good enough job of explaining that this was a minefield, and I've probably increased your anxiety and doubled the number of mines that you now have to cross in that minefield to think about that. But I just wanted to bring home, because as somebody who runs sessions like this myself, it can quite easily fall into one of those things that's nice to think about, but it's not the most pressing issue. And actually, I think it, as Katie was saying, it underlines many of the fundamental decisions that we make day in, day out, and could be a real cause of tension and stress for us as well, when we realise that our own personal and professional ethics and philosophies are maybe out of whack with those of our organisations and their approach to things.